Slavoj Zizek is a communist philosopher and expert on German philosopher and proto-communist Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Zizek is an absolute character, a man who enjoys dirty jokes and long stories with many detours. For a long time, I've enjoyed listening to Zizek and reading his work. He's interesting, to say the least, and so are his ideas. But so much of what Zizek was saying didn't make sense to me. I could understand his individual points, but I never understood what his larger ideas were. I couldn't see the connecting string between his thoughts. But then I played Disco Elysium a few times. In trying to understand Disco Elysium, I understood Zizek more deeply. And by understanding Zizek, I felt I had a deeper understanding of Disco Elysium. Today, I want to talk about my understanding of the philosophy of Slavoj Zizek, Hegel, and Disco Elysium, and explain why I think Slavoj Zizek, or anyone studying him or Hegel, should play Disco Elysium. First off, it's just one of the most interesting games and pieces of art ever made. You play a detective, a middle-aged detective who's long past his prime and far away from what most people might consider sane. You begin the game struggling to awake and hungover from a long bender of drugs, alcohol, and disco. This bender and this hangover are so bad that you've forgotten everything. The old amnesia cliche that pops up in so many RPGs. Your name, your connections, your beliefs, your entire history. Everything is lost, but even though you may have forgotten, the consequences for everything you've done are still yours to bear. You may think, it's all that guy's fault. I'm only getting control now, so why do I have to pick up the pieces? Well, that's life, dealing with all the terrible things that have been done. Is it your fault? No, you didn't get control until now, and the forces working against you are unbelievably powerful and old. But now, it's your responsibility. No matter whose fault it is, you have to decide what to do about it. All you have left is a job to do and a scattered breadcrumb trail of paltry evidence, drunken shenanigans, and angry citizens. But you're a detective. If anyone can piece themselves back together, if anyone can piece together this mess of evidence and hearsay and trace it back to what it once was, it would be a detective, right? Well, our character isn't what anyone would think of as a good detective. Well, our character isn't what anyone would think of as a good detective. He's a mess of inner dialogues and contradicting emotions pulling him this way and that. A drunk, a junkie, an eccentric. How could this man solve the case? How could this man fix anything when clearly all he's done up to this point is cause pain for himself and those around him? Well, the thing is, a cop has to deal with people. A cop has to understand people, and people are illogical, paradoxical, walking contradictions, desiring one thing and doing another. We are forces of creation, but that same creative spirit seems to also be a spirit of destruction. The world shapes us, and we shape the world, an endless conflict of internal and external. It's all the external's fault, right? All the problems, all the pain. If the world was ideal, just like I want it to be, it wouldn't be so bad, would it? We could party forever in heaven with colorful lights, shiny disco balls, and without a care in the world. An Elysium where disco never dies. In medieval history, there was an idea among the peasantry of a heaven called cocaine. This was a place where roasted pigs wander about with knives in their backs to make carving easy, where grilled geese fly directly into one's mouth, where cooked fish jump out of the water and land at one's feet. The weather is always mild, the wine flows freely, sex is readily available, and all people enjoy eternal youth. Now, this idea doesn't sound bad, but we find no exploration of art, No dancing the night away, no bright lights and pumping music, no disco. Cockayne shows us the limitations of our fantasy, the pre-corruption our internal selves are born with. In Chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx explores this very same thing. He writes, "Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all. A will whose essential character and directions are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class. The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production. This misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you." End quote. What is disco but the manifestation of the desires of the bourgeois class, of a specific subculture at a specific time? And are we, as individuals, not that very same thing? The story of Disco Elysium is focused on a small part of a city and a single murder investigation, but its wider world and the economic and political landscape of that world is absolutely central to the case and to the game's characters, as it often is in reality. While this world is very grounded and believable, it's also extremely creative. One of the most interesting pieces of the game's lore is what's called the Pale. The Pale is the realm of mind and ideas, a metaphysical ocean that takes up space in the physical world. When the Pale was discovered, everyone was excited to see what was on the other side, believing it would be some kind of heaven, and beyond the Pale, there was only more land, more of the material world to be explored, settled, and lived on, same as the land before. An interesting parallel to the Pale that I find is one about the frontier of new ideas. And considering the Pale's nature as a metaphysical realm of the mind, Disco Elysium seems to be interested in this as well. I'm reminded of Plato's cave when looking at the Pale. For those who haven't heard the allegory of the cave, it goes like this. Using our senses to understand the world is like being trapped in a dark cave and believing the shadows are the real world. Plato believed that through logic and the power of mind we could find real, actual truth, which he called the forms. We would no longer be held down in the cave believing in shadows. By understanding the forms, we could create a better world. In much the same way, when the Pale was discovered, they thought it would take them to paradise. To analyze the problems with the idea of looking at the world through Platonic forms, let's think about the form of the police officer. According to Plato, this would involve finding the person who fulfills the role of police officer best. I'd put our partner in Disco Elysium, Kim Kitsurugi, as a pretty damn close to the form of the cop. And Harry Dubois, the main character, I would say is probably one of the worst cops. But without bad cops, the good cops can't exist. Without Harry, Kim simply wouldn't be what he is. And despite not fulfilling the form of the good cop, Harry manages to solve the case. He performs the job in a way that seems counterintuitive, but he gets it done in ways no one else could have. It's Harry's very nature of unorthodoxy and following random leads that makes him the right man for the job. In exploring Harry, we can see the further problems with Plato. It's been long shown that even our own minds are shadows to us. David Hume, the philosopher, shows us that the mind is in itself illogical, that logic is based only off of assumptions made due to desires and feelings. Neurologists and philosophers Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris show psychological and neurological data showing that most thought happens subconsciously, that our experience of our mind isn't what's actually happening, but merely a simplified representation. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, provides even more psychological data and anthropological data in his book The Righteous Mind to show how our minds are mysteries even to ourselves. In other words, crossing the pale, understanding our minds more, has simply brought us back into the cave from which we thought it would help us escape. What lies at the heart of our minds, at the basis of logic itself, is paradox and contradiction. Quantum physics shows us the most fundamental part of existence is formed utterly by paradox and nonsensical systems. The realm of the forms, the world of ideas, isn't corrupted by the material world like Plato and the Gnostics thought. We view the shadows of our ideas in our own minds, convincing ourselves they're perfect and uncorrupted just as Plato did. But the flaws and corruption are already there within the idea itself, whether we know it or not. Slavoj Zizek talks about how we believe the real world corrupts our fantasies, that ideas can be good on paper but bad in practice. But Zizek says no, this is not the case. Our fantasies themselves are already corrupted. Harry Dubois himself is full of all these different skills that make up his character. You constantly have different parts of him talking to you, arguing, holding contradictory beliefs, and conflicting. Is Harry a good guy or a bad guy? Well, he's both. He's the sum of all these parts. He's a walking contradiction. He's a man who's in a constant state of discovering and conflicting with himself. As are we all. But that's what it is to be human. Harry was in his prime in what Disco Elysium's world calls the Age of the New, a time of free thinking, art, change, and disco. Out of the new also came the philosophy of moralism. At the beginning of Disco Elysium, when Harry wakes up from his drunken and drug-fueled bender, you have the option to look in the mirror. When you do, you're greeted with a face that's barely holding together. A face destroyed by age and partying. A face that still holds on to an expression of disco, an expression that attempts to be suave. Despite this expression being creepy and downright disgusting for a man of your age with your face. This scene with the mirror isn't just about Harry's face, though. This is the new. It slowly became the status quo, and now it's as old and decrepit as Harry. But it still keeps that damn face, trying to hold on to what was. The name, Disco Elysium itself, shows us the futility of this, the contradiction of the fantasy of this bright, consumerist heaven. Disco is bright, fun, ecstatic. Elysium is eternal, a paradise. But the thing is, you can't disco forever. And when you try, you end up like Harry. The moralists created the moral intern, the game's United Nations stand-in. The moralists create a logical system that slowly calculates how to keep things most civil and provide the most wellness across the world. And then the bureaucracy of the moral intern slowly enacts these ideas. The game's central conflict is between the White Pines Company and the Dockworkers Union. You can think of the White Pines as the status quo or thesis, and then the Union as the new idea or antithesis. The moralists are centrist, who believe they can synthesize these two groups, that we can all simply learn to work together and syncretize all our beliefs. But it's clear that this isn't working, and it hasn't been working for years at this point. So what do we do when our own minds are shadows, when we can't use logic to make our systems or find the actual truth? Well, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the German philosopher that Zizek is so fond of, has an interesting view on this. Hegel's work would inspire Marxism and most socialism and communist philosophies. Hegel believes that contradiction is what allows anything to exist, agreeing with some interpretations of what quantum physics would say. The rule creates the exception, and the exception creates the rule. This is Hegel's theory of phenomenology. A great example of how this works is in Disco Elysium. A man discovers the song, it's called, from the Pale. But the song only exists in the Pale because someone discovered it. The Pale is created by our minds, but at the same time we discover things from the Pale that our minds haven't really created yet. He creates the song by finding the song in the Pale. Now, this is paradoxical and completely nonsensical, right? But Hegel believes that this is the very way anything exists. Hegelian thinking is to look not for a logical truth, a 1 or a 0, but narrow down the fundamental conflict or paradox that creates truth. To give a few examples of Hegelian thinking, first I'll use an example most people will be familiar with. I might say something like fuck you to a good friend or insult them, but this may actually be a term of endearment, a sign that I care. You may hear a saying of, if I didn't talk shit to you, that's how you would know I really didn't like you. Another example of Hegelian thinking, this one being Hegelian moral thinking, can be found in a story by the Russian writer Lacan. Lacan writes about two young girls who knew a poor woman. This is a favorite story of Zizek. That's who I first heard this from. But Lacan writes a story about two young girls who know a poor woman. This woman has a child and no way to make money. She and her child will surely starve. So the girls go to the local priest and threaten to tell everyone that he did things I can't say on YouTube to them, and if he doesn't give the old woman money to survive. So they're going to tell everybody he did these things to them if he doesn't give the old woman money to survive. And they keep this up for months, and eventually the girls, the woman, and the priest, they all become friends. Now, is this action morally right or wrong? The action itself seems to be a contradiction, doing something wrong to get a good conclusion for everyone involved. Lastly, I'll use Slavoj Zizek himself showing Hegelian thought. Zizek is talking about his love of Christianity, and he tells the story of Jesus on the cross, quoting Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Zizek uses this to interpret the story as saying the Father has left us, the Son has died, and all that's left is love, the Holy Spirit. This is completely wrong if you read the text. It just really doesn't line up. But at the same time, this version of the story is so much more resonant to me and more beautiful to me than canonical Christianity. So even though Zizek's Christian message doesn't fit what we may think of as the form of Christianity, it is somehow reaches even more of a true conclusion. Now, how does this relate to communism, is the next question. Well, communism and socialism are built on the conflict of the individual and the community. The communist and the socialist believe that the greatest independence can be achieved by accepting our dependence on one another, that working together and relying on each other is actually what sets us free, allowing us to become our best, most true selves. It's a belief that seems illogical and contradictory. It doesn't seem to fit the form of a good society. But Harrier Dubois doesn't fit the form of a good cop. A developer making a game about communism using money from investors doesn't fit the form of a good idea. You'll see tons of reviews saying that Disco Elysium doesn't fit the form of a good video game because it's just reading, and making choices in video games should have action. The game's story and tone doesn't fit neatly into any genre. It's comedy and drama. Its tone is depressing and somehow optimistic at the same time. But somehow, when you accept the contradictions and the paradoxes, it all becomes understandable. But Disco Elysium didn't manage to turn me into a hammer and sickle revolutionary. One reason for this, we can use an example of The Wolf of Wall Street. In this movie, Matthew McConaughey's character, who's based on the real man who taught Jordan Belfort to be a quote unquote good stockbroker, to make a lot of money as a stockbroker. This character says, quote, "No one knows whether a stock's going to go up, down, or do loop-de-fucking loops, least of all stockbrokers." End quote. And this, much like Harry, the market's seemingly random nature often allows it to deal with chaos better than bureaucracy. This is the beauty of capitalism and free markets in general, is their seemingly contradicting nature, which is very similar to the kind of thought that Hegel and Zizek and Disco Elysium have. So while I'm certainly no communist, Disco Elysium helped me learn to look at things in a Hegelian way, in a Zizek kind of way, embracing paradox and conflict. And for this reason, I think that Slavoj Zizek would absolutely adore this game. He would see it as a reflection of himself, not in the same grotesque way that Harry sees his own reflection. Although, in some ways, maybe that will be. There is a certain level of truth, of groundedness, of reality for Eastern Europeans and communism that no other writer or creator could create, because it's such a personal issue that the main creators have dealt with. In many ways, Disco Elysium is constantly reminding me of Zizek. It feels like he could have wrote it, even though there are extremely personal things in the game that nobody else could have wrote except the person who created it. But for all these reasons, I think Slavoj Zizek should play Disco Elysium. Thanks for watching. Check out my other videos in my philosophy and video games series. Later.